Do you believe people can really change? Or do they just get better at hiding things?
She didn't even bother to sugarcoat it. No flashy clothes, Jess. This day is about me, she snapped, her voice sharp like a slap over the phone line, the kind of tone people use when they're used to getting what they want without having to justify it. I was standing in my kitchen, still in my uniform pants, boots by the door, sit on my elbow from a garage fire earlier that morning, listening to my younger sister dictate who I was allowed to be on her wedding day, as if I were some side character in a movie she wrote, directed, and starred in since we were kids. I nodded, though she couldn't see it, and muttered something that passed for agreement, mostly because arguing with Natalie had always felt like trying to staple Jell-O to a ceiling, messy, pointless, and likely to leave you cleaning up a disaster someone else created. She never wanted a conversation. She wanted submission. And, honestly, after 30-some years of being the other daughter, the reliable one, the one who didn't get her own birthday parties because Natalie's fell just a week later, and it makes more sense to celebrate together, I didn't have the energy to fight. But that didn't mean I didn't feel the fire creeping up the back of my neck as I clicked end call, and stood there in the silence of my own house, the heat of resentment curling behind my ribs like smoke looking for oxygen. The funny thing is, I wasn't planning on wearing my uniform. Not until she made it a rule. Because Natalie has always had this habit, no, this talent, for turning even the smallest requests into tight little leashes, always wrapped in tulle and pearl and soft pinks. The aesthetic of someone who wants you to believe she's delicate while stepping on your goddamn throat. It wasn't about the dress code. It was about control. It always has been. That evening, I sat on the edge of my bed with the closet door open, the light hitting the corner where my Firefighter class a uniform hung in its garment bag like a secret waiting to be unzipped. It hadn't been out since the awards ceremony the year before, when our station received commendations for pulling 3 kids out of a trailer blaze just outside of town. The fire was brutal. One of my team broke a wrist. I came home with smoke in my lungs and a citation I hung in the hallway out of habit, not pride. I don't even think Natalie knew about it. If she did, she never said. My mother had sent a text that morning saying be careful and then went radio silent the rest of the week. They were busy planning a brunch. I poured myself a whiskey and sat in silence, watching the sun slip low behind the rooftops, the orange light filtering through blinds and throwing shadows over the carpet. I kept thinking about what it meant that she didn't want me to wear anything flashy. As if honoring the job I'd worked my ass off for, the one that stole my sleep and bruised my body and changed how I saw death, was somehow an act of attention-seeking. As if being a firefighter, a goddamn public servant, was some costume I was supposed to take off when it didn't match her Pinterest board. And the thing is, I might have let it go. I might have worn the stupid taupe dress I ordered online and tried to disappear into a folding chair at table 4 like she clearly wanted. But then, 3 days before the wedding, I overheard her on speakerphone while I dropped by Mom's house to pick up a box of old photo albums. She was talking to the caterer, laughing about how Jess always tries to make things about her, like being a firefighter is a personality. I stopped in the hallway. My mother didn't correct her. She didn't even flinch. Just chuckled softly, the way people do when they agree but don't want the blame. That moment, that one comment, that one silence, was what did it. Because here's the thing about fires, they don't start big. They start small. A spark, a wire, a careless word. And if no one does anything, they spread. They consume. They devour everything soft and good and quiet until only steel and bone are left standing. I took the box of photos home and, that night, pulled my uniform from the bag. I ran my hands down the creases, checked every button, polished the badge until it caught the lamplight. I laid it out across my bed like armor and sat beside it, remembering every time I'd walked into hell with a hose on my back and a radio in my ear. And it occurred to me, as I stared down at that uniform, that this wasn't about the wedding at all. This wasn't even about Natalie. This was about finally letting the room go quiet for me. It's not revenge if you're just showing up as yourself, right? At least that's what I told myself as I texted my RSVP confirmation to Natalie that night. Thanks for the invite, I typed. I'll be there. Can't wait. The ... popped up, then vanished. No reply. The next morning, I was back at the station at 5 a.m., drilling with my crew, dragging water lines across concrete while the sun came up hot and unforgiving. As I scrubbed the rig, I felt the usual rhythm come back: routine, precision, focus. But beneath it all, something else hummed. Anticipation. Maybe even a little something close to thrill. Because Natalie wanted a quiet day. And I was about to give her exactly that, just not the kind she had in mind. There's something deeply strange about watching your own childhood replay through someone else's version of it, especially when that someone's entire adult identity is built on the prettiest pieces of half-truths and careful omissions. Polished like sea glass until there are no sharp edges left, just soft pastel colors that go well with bridal shower centerpieces and Instagram captions. That was Natalie in a nutshell. Every memory reinterpreted to fit a narrative where she was the star, and the rest of us were just background noise or supporting roles she could fade in and out depending on the season. The rehearsal dinner was held at a country club on the edge of town, the kind with a fake lake and a valet who looked too young to legally drive, let alone park someone else's Lexus. I arrived 10 minutes early, because despite what Natalie might say about me behind closed doors, I still have a thing for showing up when I say I will. I wore the taupe dress, the one she approved of after texting me a list of neutral options that won't clash with the floral palette, and I walked in feeling exactly like she wanted me to feel: small, compliant, forgettable. No one greeted me when I entered. No one even looked twice. The room was loud with laughter and expensive perfume, voices carrying across white linen-covered tables, and I could already tell that my role here was to be invisible. She spotted me eventually, across the room, mid-laugh with one of Doug's cousins, and her face did this thing she probably thought she hid well, where her smile stiffened just slightly and her eyes narrowed for half a second before she blinked it away and waved. The look wasn't surprise. It was satisfaction. I had done exactly what she asked, and now she could move on, secure in the knowledge that, once again, she was the sun around which everyone else orbited. Doug was standing near the bar, drink in hand, dressed like someone who lived in Pinterest boards instead of real life, all fitted cuffs and soft pastel tie, his hair styled within an inch of its life. He nodded at me as I approached, but didn't say much, which wasn't unusual. Doug had always been polite in that way that feels almost apologetic, like he's constantly sorry to exist. I think that's part of why he and Natalie worked. He never tried to outshine her. He didn't even reflect her light. He just absorbed it quietly. I found a seat near the end of the table, beside Uncle Ray, who was already working on his second scotch and muttering something about fancy-ass shrimp and spoons. Ray was the kind of relative you kept just sober enough to make it through dinner without a scene, and just drunk enough that someone would have to give him a ride home. He smelled like aftershave and dry cleaning, and when he leaned over and whispered, "You look like someone who just swallowed a bad thought," I didn't bother denying it. I just said, "She said no uniforms," and he let out a dry laugh, the kind that says he's heard the song before, just in a different key. We made it through dinner with the usual rounds of toasts, speeches full of inside jokes and shallow sentiment, and I listened with a tight smile while Natalie's maid of honor told a story about how Natalie once organized a blood drive at college and single-handedly got 200 donors, conveniently skipping the part where I was the one who pulled strings at the fire department to make that happen. But that's the thing about Natalie's world: you can be helpful, you can even be essential, as long as you don't expect credit, and God forbid you ever shine brighter than her. Mom came over during dessert, resting a hand on my shoulder like she always does when she wants to offer comfort without making eye contact. "Thank you for being so gracious," she said, and it landed not as a compliment, but a subtle command to keep playing along. I nodded and reached for my glass of wine. If I had spoken then, I would have said something I couldn't take back. Later, as the crowd thinned and the staff started clearing plates, I stepped outside for air. The night was humid and still, the kind of evening that made your skin feel sticky with memory. I leaned against a railing and looked out over the manicured lawn, perfectly trimmed and utterly lifeless. And then I heard the door creak behind me and Uncle Ray stepped out, drink in hand, shirt untucked like he'd already given up on appearances. He didn't say anything right away. just lit a cigarette with a hand that trembled slightly and stared out into the dark like it owed him something. Finally, he said, "You know, she's always been like this. Since she was 5. Had to win at everything, even Christmas. You let her have her moment, and she'll keep taking until you don't got any left." I didn't reply, just kept staring into the shadows, thinking about that fire when we were teenagers, the one Natalie never talks about, not because it was traumatic, but because she never had to do anything. I was 15, she was 12. The dryer caught, filled the hallway with smoke. She froze. I didn't. I got her out, dragged her across the lawn by the back of her t-shirt, put a wet dish towel over her mouth like I'd seen in a safety video once. The firefighters showed up, doused it, said we were lucky. That was the first time I really thought, maybe this job was what I was meant to do. But when Natalie tells the story, she always leaves that part out. In her version, the fire wasn't that serious. She helped somehow. She always helps in her stories. Ray exhaled smoke and said, "So what's the plan, kid?" I glanced at him, surprised. "What do you mean?" He smiled, but not kindly. "You're not gonna take that, are you? Girl like you, uniform like that, and she wants you to fade into the wallpaper so she can feel taller." He paused, then added, "Thought you had more fire in you." I didn't answer right away. Instead, I pulled out my phone, scrolled through my camera roll, and found the photo I kept tucked way back, me in full dress uniform, standing straight as a flagpole next to the engine, sit still on my face, smile tight with pride and exhaustion. I stared at it for a long moment, then slipped the phone back in my pocket. "I do," I said quietly. Ray nodded. "Then let her burn." He flicked the cigarette into the grass and walked back inside. And I stood there alone under the heavy night, heart pounding not with rage but something colder, something sharper, like the edge of a decision I didn't know I was making until it had already been made. The morning of the wedding came wrapped in an eerie stillness, the kind of too quiet calm that usually settles before a storm, not because the day itself demanded peace, but because something deep inside me had shifted into a state of deliberate stillness. Like when a firefighter crouches just outside the smoke line, listening to the creaks in the ceiling before deciding whether to push forward or retreat. I woke up early, not out of nerves, not because I cared about the ceremony, not even because I had some grand plan, but because my body had learned over the years to rise before dawn, trained by alarms and adrenaline. By nights broken into fragments and mornings spent chasing down disaster in worn boots and heavy gear. That muscle memory doesn't just disappear because someone you share a bloodline with decided that today is about her. I made coffee with one hand while checking the polish on my uniform boots with the other, moving through my apartment like a machine, measured, focused, completely calm on the surface, but pulsing with something beneath that I couldn't quite name. Maybe it was anger, though it didn't feel hot and erratic like the kind I used to have in my 20s, when I'd slam doors or throw words like grenades and regret them almost immediately. No, this was different. This was slow burn, deeply rooted, the kind of cold fury that creeps in like carbon monoxide, undetectable until you're already dizzy and past the point of escape. I laid the uniform out across the back of the couch, its dark navy fabric stark against the beige upholstery, the badge catching the early light in a way that almost looked staged, though it wasn't. There was something sacred about it, even now. The weight of that uniform wasn't just in the fabric or the stitching or the metals, it was in everything I'd seen, everything I'd endured, everything I'd lost. It carried the smoke of every fire I'd walked into, the blood of strangers I'd tried to keep breathing, the faces of children who made it out and the ones who didn't. And Natalie had the audacity to reduce all of that to flashy, like it was a rhinestone jacket I wore for attention, like this career, this calling, was some inconvenience to her color scheme. By 10 a.m. I was showered, dressed in the taupe fallback she'd approved, hair pulled back tight, makeup minimal, all of it done with the same mechanical precision I use when prepping for a 24-hour shift. Get it done, get it over with. Keep your emotions out of it. I didn't touch the uniform. Not yet. I left it hanging there untouched, waiting like a decision I hadn't quite committed to. Let her have her morning, I thought. Let her get through the vows, the photo ops, the first dance. Let her think she's won. The church was a sprawling, picturesque monstrosity, white columns, floral arches, pews that creaked under the weight of too many expectations and too much family history. The second I stepped inside, I could feel eyes skim over me and pass by, not stopping, not registering. I was exactly what she wanted, invisible, neutral, unremarkable. The air smelled like perfume, hairspray, and tightly held secrets. Natalie floated down the aisle in a dress that looked like it had taken a small army to construct, every inch of lace and beadwork carefully curated to look effortless, which, of course, was the point. I stood off to the side, not quite in the bridal party, not quite a guest, somewhere in that no-man's land reserved for people whose presence is tolerated but not celebrated. There were brief moments during the ceremony, small flickers, when I caught her eye. Not long, just glances. Each time, I caught a look that I knew all too well: satisfaction, ownership, the smug knowledge that she'd choreographed every detail, down to my silence. And I gave her nothing in return. No frown, no smirk, no twitch of resistance. I gave her blankness. Let her interpret it however she wanted. After the ceremony, the photographer herded people around like cattle, barking out names and groupings while guests adjusted their dresses and sucked in their stomachs. I was called into one picture with the family, off to the side, next to Mom, not centered, not highlighted. Natalie posed with her arm around Doug's neck, her smile sharp enough to draw blood if you stood too close. And I thought, not for the first time, how exhausting it must be to live that way, to curate every moment like it's being filmed, to treat your life like a brand. Back at my car, parked behind the reception hall, I sat for a long time with the door open, letting the stale heat roll out, my hands resting on the steering wheel like I was waiting for a sign. I reached back and grabbed the garment bag, unzipping it slowly, like peeling something sacred. The uniform was perfect. I held it up, ran my fingers down the front, adjusted the epaulets, smoothed the creases. Then I pulled the badge from the small velvet case and pinned it over my heart. It caught the sun. It felt right. There's something powerful about putting on the clothes that made you. Not the ones someone else picked to minimize you, not the ones you wear to blend in, but the ones that speak for you before you open your mouth. I zipped the front closed, straightened the collar, checked the mirror once, just once, and then stepped out of the car. As I walked toward the entrance, boots clicking against the asphalt, I could feel the silence building already, like the whole world was holding its breath. But I wasn't nervous. I wasn't even angry anymore. I was clear. She said she wanted a quiet day, and I was going to give her the quietest moment she'd ever known. I didn't step into that reception hall expecting applause, attention, or any grand display of redemption. I've seen too much, lost too many, and stood too long in doorways full of smoke and screams to think that anything, least of all a carefully planned suburban wedding, would suddenly become the moment people understood me. But I did expect a shift, subtle maybe, imperceptible to some, but real. A kind of tectonic adjustment. The kind that happens not with fireworks, but with silence so absolute that it forces people to feel the weight of what they've been pretending not to see for years. And that's exactly what happened when I pushed open those wide French doors and stepped inside in full dress blues, my boots echoing against the polished wood floors like a countdown. It wasn't dramatic in the movie way, no dropped glasses, no sudden gasps, but there was a hush, an immediate and complete one, the kind that spreads like a ripple across still water when someone tosses in a stone too heavy to ignore. Conversations trailed off mid-sentence. Heads turned. The string quartet faltered for a beat. Somewhere near the cake table, I caught sight of someone nudging their spouse, eyebrows lifted, lips mouthing something that looked suspiciously like, "Is that her sister?" And in that moment, as I crossed the threshold with my spine straight and my face calm, not defiant, not smug, just still, I realized that I wasn't there to prove anything. I was just there to finally let them see what I'd been all along. Natalie was standing near the front, greeting guests, her back partially turned, laughing politely with an elderly couple in matching pastel outfits. She hadn't seen me yet, but I watched as the mood around her began to change, how the people closest to her started to glance over her shoulder. Their attention slowly peeled away, like a tide turning without warning. Her fiancé, Doug, spotted me first. He didn't react with shock or dismay. He didn't frown. He didn't signal anyone to intervene. Instead, he looked at me for a moment, really looked, and then gave a small nod, almost respectful, as if something in him recognized that I had crossed some invisible line with purpose, and he wasn't going to pretend otherwise. Then Frank, Doug's father, the Vietnam vet who'd spent most of the weekend sipping scotch in the corner and saying very little, stood up from his chair near the edge of the room. He walked toward me slowly, his step sure, his face unreadable until he was close enough that I could see the crease lines around his eyes. He stopped a foot away, looked me up and down, then extended his hand in the kind of deliberate, weighty gesture that men of his generation reserve for moments that actually mean something. "Damn proud of what you do," he said, not loudly, but firmly. The words meant not just for me, but for everyone within earshot, and that was most of the room. We shook hands, and I could feel every pair of eyes pressing down on the moment like it was a photograph being etched into memory. No one clapped. No one spoke. But the energy shifted, so sharp and sudden it was almost physical. When Frank turned to walk back to his seat, I caught Natalie's face across the crowd. Her smile had cracked into something that resembled disbelief, maybe even fear, and for a fraction of a second, she looked small, stripped of all her practiced elegance and polished composure, like someone who'd built a sandcastle too close to the tide. I didn't approach her right away. I let her stew in the discomfort of her unraveling control, let her soak in the knowledge that this was no stunt, no scene, no spotlight grab. I stood near the bar, speaking quietly with Frank, listening as he told me about the firehouse he used to visit as a kid in Milwaukee, how the men there were like gods to him. How he'd once watched them pull 2 children out of a collapsed tenement and carry them down the ladder like angels made of muscle and soot. His voice caught slightly at the end, and I realized that this man, this stranger I'd barely exchanged 2 words with before, saw me in a way my own family never had. When the toasts began, I drifted toward the back of the room, not to hide, but to watch. The maid of honor stood with a champagne flute and launched into a story about Natalie's college years, full of exaggerated praise and carefully curated memories, none of which included me, of course. That part one expected. But then Doug took the microphone, smiling nervously, and began thanking everyone, his parents, the venue staff, the planner, and then, unexpectedly, he paused and turned toward me. "I also want to thank Jess," he said, his voice gaining steadiness as the words came. "I know today was about Natalie and me, but seeing someone in uniform reminds us that there are people out there doing real things, hard things, every day, so the rest of us can live our lives in peace. That kind of quiet strength doesn't always get celebrated, but maybe it should." The room didn't erupt into applause, but a few people did clap. Others nodded. I caught sight of Mom, sitting stiffly near the head table, hands folded tightly in her lap, face unreadable. Natalie didn't look at me once during that speech. Not when Doug spoke. Not when Frank raised his glass in my direction. Not even when a distant cousin came over and whispered, "You look incredible," with genuine admiration. She kept her eyes locked forward, her posture perfect, her fingers clenched so tightly around her wine glass, I half expected it to shatter. Eventually, she did come over. Not alone, of course, never alone, but flanked by 2 of her friends, one of whom peeled away the moment it became clear Natalie wasn't smiling for photos. Her approach was slow, measured, the way someone walks toward a stray dog they think might bite. She stopped in front of me and waited a beat, the silence between us thick with years of unspoken tension. Then, finally, she spoke, her voice low and sharp as a scalpel. "You always have to make it about you." I smiled, not wide, not gloating, just a slight curve that said more than words ever could. "No," I replied, keeping my voice calm, even. "I've just stopped pretending I'm not here." She didn't have a response to that. Not a real one. She stood there for another second, her lips pressed into a thin line, and then turned and walked away, her heels clicking angrily against the floor. As she retreated into the crowd, I could feel something uncoil in my chest, not triumph, not relief, but a kind of bittersweet clarity. This wasn't a victory, because nothing about this moment erased the years of being diminished, dismissed, background. But it was a shift. It was the first time I stood in a room full of people who mattered to her, and they saw me, not as her older sister, not as a plus one, not as the firefighter one, but as someone who had earned the right to stand tall. And I wasn't done yet. The reception, like so many meticulously crafted social rituals, kept moving forward with the artificial grace of a train running just slightly behind schedule, polished, rehearsed, and utterly detached from the rawness of anything that might have actually mattered to the people trapped within its carefully constructed itinerary. Guests returned to their seats. Servers began setting down plated desserts that looked more like art than food, and the DJ, oblivious to the ripple that had just sliced through the room's polished surface, announced the first dance with the kind of overenthusiastic cheer that seemed almost designed to smother any lingering awkwardness beneath a layer of upbeat soundtrack and polite applause. And yet, despite all efforts to reassert control over the atmosphere, something fundamental had changed. I stood near the back, hands folded behind my back in a stance I'd learned during my earliest days in the academy, firm, neutral, immovable, not because I needed to assert power, but because I understood, now more than ever, that real strength didn't come from volume or visibility, but from quiet refusal. Refusal to shrink, to bend, to disappear. I watched as Natalie and Doug glided across the dance floor, their choreographed waltz spinning through the middle of the room, the fabric of her dress catching the soft light like a net designed to trap every eye. She smiled the way she always did when all eyes were on her, wide, bright, and hollow at the center. But when her gaze briefly flicked toward me, hovering just a moment too long before snapping back to Doug, I saw it, something fraying beneath the surface, a thread pulled too tight and beginning to give. Later, as the music shifted into that middle ground between elegant and generic, guests began drifting from their chairs to the bar, their conversations loosening with wine and mild exhaustion. I could feel the subtle magnetism of curiosity drawing people toward me one by one, some under the guise of idle conversation, others with thinly veiled admiration, and a few, mostly the older ones, with the directness that comes from a lifetime of not caring about social nuance. One woman, her silver hair pinned in place with a comb that sparkled under the chandeliers, leaned in and said, "You wear that uniform like it means something," and I simply nodded because, for once, I didn't feel the need to justify who I was to anyone in the room. Then Frank returned, this time without his scotch, looking more thoughtful than before, his hands tucked into his pockets as he spoke quietly, just for me to hear. "You know," he said, his voice rough like gravel but deliberate, "it's not often that someone walks into a room and resets the whole damn tone without raising their voice or lifting a finger. But you did that. And not for show. That's not ego. That's presence. That's earned." I didn't have words for him then, not because I didn't appreciate it, but because sometimes silence says more than gratitude ever could. And then, unexpectedly, Doug himself wandered over, not in a dramatic flourish, not dragged by Natalie, but alone, with a kind of slow, measured walk that suggested he'd been thinking hard about something and had finally decided to face it head-on. He didn't shake my hand, didn't reach out, just stood beside me, watching the room the same way I was. After a long pause, he said, almost absently, "She told everyone you worked dispatch. That you weren't really a firefighter. That you just did admin work at the station." He didn't say it with malice or surprise, just resignation, as if he, too, had grown accustomed to the ways Natalie reshaped reality when it suited her. I turned my head slowly and met his gaze. "That tracks," I said, and he gave a small, bitter laugh, not at me, but at the absurdity of it all. "She never told me about the fire," he added, softer now, "the one when you were kids. I heard about it from Ray last night. Said you dragged her out yourself. Said she never mentioned it. Said he didn't know why." I shrugged, not because I didn't care, but because I'd long since given up expecting truth from Natalie's stories. "Maybe she forgot," I said, though we both knew that forgetting had nothing to do with it. Doug shook his head. She forgets what doesn't make her the hero, he murmured, and then, after another long silence, he added, "Thank you for showing up." There was something in the way he said it that made me wonder whether he was thanking me for more than just attending the wedding. Eventually, the night began to wind down, as these things do, with half-eaten cake, discarded heels, and men loosening their ties in dim corners. I danced once, with Uncle Ray, who insisted and smelled like cigars and nostalgia, and again with Frank, who moved slowly and deliberately, as though every step was an act of respect. I didn't dance with Doug, not because it would have been scandalous, but because it would have been unnecessary. Just before I left, Natalie found me again, this time without her entourage, her makeup slightly smudged at the corners and her voice lower, tinged with a kind of desperation she wasn't skilled enough to hide. "I hope you're happy," she said, not like someone offering closure, but like someone demanding an explanation for a crime she still didn't understand. I looked at her, and for once I didn't feel the usual heat rise in my chest, didn't feel the need to argue or defend or point out all the ways she'd twisted the truth for so long she no longer recognized it. Instead, I simply said, "You told me this day was about you. But it turns out, people like knowing who's got their back." She opened her mouth to reply, but I was already walking away. I left before the bouquet toss, before the sparklers, before the last, exhausted playlist of slow songs. I drove home in silence, windows down, the uniform still crisp on my body, the badge over my heart cool and solid in the night air. At a red light, my phone buzzed. A message. I didn't recognize the number at first, but when I opened it, the words were simple. "If my house ever catches fire, I hope it's you kicking the door in." It was from Frank. I didn't respond. Because some praise is meant to be carried quietly, like a medal you don't wear but always keep close. As I pulled into my driveway and shut off the engine, I realized something I hadn't allowed myself to admit until right then. Not every fire demands water. Some just need air. And sometimes the most honest thing you can do is let it burn. Not out of vengeance. Not even for justice. But because not everything broken is yours to fix. Some flames, I thought, are there to remind you what you'll never be again.